today we're talking about living through loss. And, you know, if you're on and you've decided to join, it's probably because there's something that's drawing you to this discussion besides our two amazing guests. And that's that we all experience loss. And, you know, how we rate that on the scale of minor to traumatic, but we all know what loss feels like. So I would love to talk about, you know, sort of direct this conversation in light of resilience. I'm curious, and I would love to hear, Shai, if you could begin. You know, does the ability of a person to bounce back from loss have anything to do with how significant or traumatic the loss is? Is there any type of correlation there?
So personal, even though there's like so many, like if you do the research on it, there'll be stages and tasks and all these different things, but it's really just a very, very personal experience. And I learned so much regularly from all types of loss, from everyone, in the way that everybody's grieving on a personal level. That being said, it is possible for traumatic loss to be more distressing, but it doesn't have to be that way. Any type of loss can be like your world is crashing and the world is threatening and all of that. So it's definitely possible, and research might show that it could be more distressing for people, but it does not have to be that way. There's people have PTSD symptoms from people who have died from just chronic illness, you know, mourning that loss. So it definitely does not have to be that way, but you may see it.
Yeah, so I think that there are expectations that make it harder. I think societal expectations of what bouncing back looks like makes it much more difficult for people, because I think somehow when we're stressed out and it's like, oh, there's this expectation, then we do less. So I always tell families, like, it's the less expectations we have of ourselves and of others around us, and giving them the space actually helps people, you know, so to speak, bounce back. I think also the reality is, and this is just an interesting piece, I did a training across different religious sectors. It was actually in California, and I was sitting with people who were of every faith and everything, and we all had to share something in our faith about grief. And when I shared the process in Judaism of the fact that we have 7 days that we mourn, the first thing I got was, oh my gosh, you got 7 days paid leave, you guys. Like, if you're working, and I never thought about that, right? And the fact that we have, when it's a loss of a parent, there's the first 30 days that people are not doing an awful lot of things. And then all of a sudden you have a year that you're not joining people for parties and you're not listening to music and stuff like that. And then every single year, even if 45 years passes, during the holidays, we say Yisker. During Yahrzeit, there's this day where actual mourning, almost like the first year, like you can't go to parties, you can't listen to music, all that stuff. And as I'm saying this, I'm noticing like people really leaning in on this, of the fact that there is a societal trend in Western society of like, okay, loss is not really that bad. We bounce back. We do that's a sign of strength. And I think the sign that we've been set up with, and the model that we've been set up with from God, is just like, we take time. And that grief is a forever thing. I think we will forever grieve people. I mean, it's years, but we don't have that person, or we don't have that life that we envisioned, or we don't have whatever it is that we're grieving back. It's really hard to say that somebody bounces back from that. I always say it's not moving on, it's moving forward.
Interesting. So you are really challenging this idea of bouncing back at all, of recovery.
I think
from
that
grief.
Society has created something that looks, and Shaya, feel free to disagree with me, but I think that society has created this idea that there is a structure to grief, and that the last step of that is acceptance. And we just, at that point, we accept, and guess what? We come out of this cave and we've like done really well. And I watched an interview with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who created those 5 stages. And she literally was like begging people, this was not created for grief. This was created for death and dying, for people who are dying. And at some point they need to accept their fate, because that is it. And this is the end line. And there isn't anything beyond that end line. When it comes to grief and grieving, people have adapted that like as though this ends. It's much more of a flow.
Yeah, I was going to say also, you know that quote from Sigmund Freud, where he wrote a letter to Ludwig Binswanger, whatever his name is, an existential psychiatrist, and I could read the quote if you want. He said, although we know that after such a loss, the acute state of mourning will subside, we also know we shall remain inconsolable and will never find a substitute. No matter what may fill the gap, even if it be filled completely, it nevertheless remains something else. And actually, that is how it should be. It is the only way of perpetuating that love which we do not want to relinquish. So I think it's like very much what Rivkah is saying is that you're sort of just shifting, but the loss is always there. There's no like start and you're shifting. It's also an expression of love, the grieving process. So it's really staying connected is really a key feature with grief. And like a lot of times we think we have to move on. That means like forget what happened, forget the relationship, forget everything. When in reality, grief is really an expression, a continuation of the relationship. It just looks a little bit different. So part of that process would be to, take on a new form of the relationship.
Totally. So it's not saying goodbye, closing the door on a past chapter of my life. It's developing, and really fascinating. It's very novel. Wow. And I think also, like, we live in such a hustle-based culture where, a sick day can throw anyone just completely off their game. And I'm like this. I'm like yesterday I was not feeling well. And it's like, I'm very hard on myself. Like if I'm not feeling well or if I can't do what I need to do. And, I think that like we beat up on ourselves if we're experiencing any, whether it's a loss or any type of, of emotion that gets in the way of us functioning. And I'd imagine with loss, this is something that is going to, quote unquote, get in the way of how we optimally functioned before. And we don't like that.
I think that speaks to a lot of us in terms of like, we want to be able to get back and stuff like that. But I think the reality is that physically and emotionally, it's a journey, and it's a journey that will have a lot of ups and downs. And that's just part of it. What you were saying, by the way, before about love, and I think that's a very big component, is that a lot of people don't realize is that there's a part of us that will always love somebody, stuff like that. But this is also true when there was complicated grief and where somebody lost someone who actually is tremendously relieving that this person is gone. And that could also be in a divorce or in a leaving of a relationship where it like ends and there's relief. The grief process that's there may not be the love, so to speak, in terms of that, but it may just also be about like, it's relief mixed with shame, mixed with guilt, mixed with everything. And that kind of, that cocktail can come up also. And that cocktail can come up over years.
What would you say is the role of acceptance here with loss?
Acceptance shouldn't be
Go for it.
like I reached an end. Right? It's not. You're not reaching an end. You're perpetuating. You're thriving. You're flowing. So acceptance is about a reality that there's a loss. There's a finality in terms of the physical realm of the relationship, but in terms of like. There's nothing else to really accept other than my life is going to shift. So there's going to be a lot of emotion that come up with that. There's secondary loss. My role, if it was a partner, like I'm no longer a wife, or I'm no longer a husband, or if it's a child, I'm no longer a parent, or something like that. So there's a lot of shifts that are going to take place, and we might have to accept that, which doesn't mean don't feel the feelings that come along with that. We have to feel the feelings that come along with that, which sometimes can be very, very overwhelming. We could talk about how to deal with that, but the feelings have to be felt and processed and worked through to an extent. And then the acceptance is just, this is the reality, and now we're going to shift and change this relationship and the way it looks, the way it feels.
Yeah. I think that's so well said. And I think the acceptance is also going back to what we were both saying before. I think the acceptance also is of the fact that we are no longer the people we were yesterday. And we're not. Yeah.
And the goal is
to get back. I will forever be a different person. You will forever be a different person. What were you saying, Shaya?
Right. No, people think that grief is about going back to normal, so to speak. Like we grieved and now we're going back to the way we were. And almost the expectation is if you see somebody grieving, you're like, what's with this person? They're not the same. Well, they're not supposed to be. And we're not going back to something that we were. We're actually shifting and integrating and becoming more whole in a certain way. But just we're integrating like what's happened, and we're who we were before to who we are right now. But we're not like going back.
Wow. That's very liberating. Let's talk a little bit about, the necessary qualities or factors that enable a person to move on despite loss? Is that something that, you know, oh, someone is more born
so I wanted to
resilient, or
say
is it
one
something
thing
that
is
they
that
can,
I
you know,
always
skills that
say
they can
as part of
acquire?
our intake, there are three things we try to find out about children. And I think the same is to be true about adults, right? What was the nature of the death? Was this a sudden traumatic death, or was this an illness where somebody was aware of and watched the buildup over time? The second question we ask is, what was the relationship with the deceased? And the third question we want to know is, what was the relationship like before this death with the surviving parent in our case? And I think those are the three factors that really, at the end of the day, count a lot more than just death in and of itself. You know, in our case, what we believe is that when I kind of compare it to normal birth versus a C-section, normal birth has very painful labor before it, and that's true of illness. And illness with a death following it is a lot of painful labor, but the recovery is pretty straightforward. And when illness is done right, and it really has a long way to go sometimes, but when illness is done right, then really the recovery in terms of how the grieving process goes is fairly straightforward, meaning to say it can be painful, but it's got a trajectory that's pretty clear, and people tend to come out of it okay. If it was not, and it's like that unexpected C-section and stuff like that, there may be no pain before, but there's a little bit of a convoluted recovery after. That's sort of what we look at when we see the sudden traumatic deaths. Now, add into that cocktail that there was a complicated relationship with the deceased, or a complicated relationship with the people that they now have to live with almost exclusively because the other person who covered for them is gone, and you have a cocktail. So now what we're talking about is, sometimes the line that we use in our office is loss is the least of it. And I think that's really what you're saying, is what's the factor here? The factor is not necessarily the death itself. I think any good clinician, and Shaya, you can certainly speak to this, you know, death is maybe the presenting problem right now, but it may not even be the most pressing issue or really what's holding this person back in life. It's just sometimes it looks convenient to say, well, I lost a parent, right? I'm not going to tell you about the fact that my father was an addict and that we struggled watching him for 10 years and that I always prayed he would die, and now he did, and now I blame myself, and now there's a lot of shame, and we don't talk to anybody in the community. We just say it was a heart attack instead of saying it was an addiction. So is it death that's making it complicated, or is it all of this stuff?
Wow. So a lot more complicated. Are there qualities, are there factors in terms of what people, you know, need to acquire in order to be able to deal with the loss, Shaya?
We're looking to move through. And I would say that there's actually it's funny because like the common models of grief, I guess, stages that people think about are very similar in the way that they are, but there is one that actually incorporates within the grief process the concept of like taking a break from grief, like grief relief almost, like where it's really a focus on yourself and your well-being.
Wow.
So almost like when you're exercising, and if you exercise too much, you need a day of rest, right? So the same would be true with grief, like feeling all the emotion and all everything that's going on, and all the practical things that now need to take place because there's been a loss. To take a break from that and just focus on well-being is really, really important, actually integral to the grief process. In order for you to be able to feel the feelings when they come up, you'll be much stronger, you'll be able to tolerate them better because you're taking care of yourself. So however people take care of themselves, whether that's with social interaction is very important, and doing fun things. Because sometimes people feel really guilty. How can I have a loss? How can I do fun activity? It's really, really important to nurture the creative side, journaling or play or whatever, art, different things that people can do, and even the regular routine, you know, taking your kid to school or whatever. These are all regular, I guess, things that you do when you're functioning well, and it's really important to be doing all that. And I think that will help people be much more resilient.
Interesting. Do you find from your experience, you know, working with people who have experienced significant loss in their life, that like once they were sort of thrown into the situation, they were able to build the skills necessary to handle it maybe better than they thought, or better than an outsider may have thought? Like they reversed the
There are some people who people say, and they go to their Shiva or they go to thing, and they're like, oh my gosh, that person's so strong, so capable, so everything. And I'm just like watching the house of cards come down really badly, because there's a very good ability to act well in a theater, but as soon as you exit, real life hits real hard. hard. And then there are people who everybody thought would struggle much more and had a skill set that was built. I think if I could say that there's one thing that I've noticed, it's whenever a person's ready for it, they will deal with this pain. And when they're ready to deal with the pain, then they get better. Not the situation gets better, they get better. And I think that's, you know, speaking to what we always say, you got to be working on yourself and what you're going to do with your life and all that stuff. But I think that at the same time, accepting that there's so much pain within the situation that we're living in, we can have a good life in a pretty challenging life, if that makes sense. Meaning to say, I don't have to be, and I can say this about myself, right? I have to be constantly working on myself and dealing with my stuff in order to be functional within what would be called a pretty crazy life.
Interesting. I love that. I just, at some point, what you're saying is someone may appear to be handling things well, but we can never know and never judge how.
Unfortunately, we deal with so many deaths, whether they were people who took their own life or overdosing or stuff like that, from people who appeared okay on the outside. And I just have to say this, I think that the pressure sometimes to appear okay, especially after grief or loss or any challenge in a person's life, you know, sometimes puts people in a position where they're doing things that are way out of their comfort zone and not really sustainable. So if somebody actually is sad or just even having mood swings or dealing with their anger or within a normal range, then you want to know that in a certain sense they're safer. Like when I hear the kids are acting out in a good way, I'm like, yay, we have normal, healthy people here.
Wow. Wow. Okay, so let's wrap up this conversation. So, you know, whether we're experiencing small or large losses, let's talk a little bit about, you know, the most powerful skills that we can work on in order to live through our loss and to build up those resilience muscles. Is there anything, you know, that you would say are number one or number two things that we can do within our control to strengthen ourselves?
One very important thing
Shaya?
is to give yourself permission to allow yourself to feel positive emotion. I spoke about this a little bit at the Grief Summit also. It's really, really important because also, like, since even though like maybe at one point you're doing a little better and then a new event is going on in your life and the loss comes back and the pain comes back, or maybe in a different way, but there's constant, you know, life events that will trigger the loss. So sometimes it's like, how can I be here and enjoy this, whether it's a wedding or some type of achievement that a child has made or something. I can't enjoy this with the person who we lost, so I can't enjoy it. It's important to like allow the positive emotions to come. I think that's number one. Number two is, I think, relationships, to make sure that you're being social. We need connection. It's very, very important. The whole process of Shiva is all about connecting through loss. So we have to definitely be connecting. And I think a lot of people find, I'm sure Sarah could talk more about this, about meaning, to find purpose in your own life. I think people who are impacted by grief and loss, it's like almost like they're not allowed to have meaning in their life or something like that. There's guilt or shame or something like that. So that should be totally something focused, whether with faith, with journaling, with volunteering, doing different things that help you feel good about yourself and potentially about your loved one that you've lost. And another thing is just to accomplish. It's okay, like, accomplish things. So Rivkah's accomplished an incredible amount by what she's doing. Not everyone has to do that. It would be amazing if they did, but not everyone can do that. Even if it's accomplishing a project, accomplishing a task, accomplishing feeling your emotions of grief is an accomplishment. So being able to, like, yeah, exactly, right.
Yes, getting up in the morning, right? Just getting up out of bed, brushing your teeth, even small things.
Help you feel like you're getting somewhere.
Beautiful.
Interesting. Oh, yeah, Sarah, before you comment, I just want to.
I wanted to
someone made a comment.
Say, absolutely.
You know, would this include loss, like loss of innocence? Would loss of innocence not just loss of person? We're talking about any type of emotional loss. It doesn't have to be physical loss, right?
Loss is loss. I get people all the time apologizing for following my page and loving it so much and saying, like, because I didn't really lose someone, but I lost, and they can list like a dozen things. And I'm like, that is loss. That is grief. I happen to be talking about people dying because that's the field that I'm in. But absolutely, loss's core feelings and values and pains are all the same in terms of that. I want to add something to what you were saying, Shaya, and I really think you nailed it on your list. For me, it was about acceptance of myself and the fact that I didn't always have to be the happy poster child. I didn't always have to feel whatever feelings were right for that morning. Whether it's the fact that I can go, and I've been pretty public about this, I can go to the cemetery to visit my parents and spend exactly 30 seconds at each of their graves, say hi, and like read them a shopping list of what I like really, felt like telling them that day. And literally 30 seconds later, I will drive back an hour and a half, and I have no problem with that. I came to the point where I realized that's what I need from this visit. That's what really the truth is. Like, would my parents care if I was driving through town and I just stopped them for a minute? They would love it. So you know what? I realized my parents were fun and funky people. I'm like, hi, peoples. I came to say hi, and I have much better things to do today. And that's okay. And then there are times where I want to sit there, lean into that grief, lean into the pain, scream and yell and do whatever I want. Great. You know what? I think this is the part that for me has happened every year as I get older. It's about saying, you know what? I don't know what image I had for myself and my grief journey and whatever. This may not be it, but guess what? This is what works for now. And the way to know if it's working is if it feels right. Your gut generally is good to you. And as long as you don't keep shoving it and telling your gut that it's lying, it will keep telling you the truth. And when you listen and lean into that, you really feel what feels right. And if it feels right in that moment, it probably is right. It probably is right.
I love this empowering message that you've left us with, Rivkah, to trust our intuition. It is so valuable, and we so often don't trust it because we think, oh, the experts have something else to say, or I'm wrong. But I think that is such a beautiful message to guide us. Well, thank you both so much for taking your time out of your busy schedule. This was really an enlightening conversation. Thank you for sharing your wisdom, your expertise, and your heart and soul with us. Really, to give us these nuggets of knowledge and wisdom. Rivkah, thank you for absolutely. And I want to again acknowledge Rivkah. Thank you so much for being vulnerable and sharing your story. I know that you've helped so many people. And Shaya, keep at it and keep supporting the work that Rivkah does, because we're also grateful.